Deltarune is a game that has many putting out their best theories by piecing together lore, character details, statements, and Easter eggs. Its predecessor Undertale similarly had hidden implications, but the episodic release of Deltarune and subsequent hype cycle amplify the theory rush. This is all well and good, but there's a certain aspect of storytelling I've noticed goes undervalued in this process, despite being the single most important factor. That would be the themes, or rather what the story is attempting to tell its audience. For example, Undertale had themes of pacifism and how kindness can be rewarding. This is the single strongest predictor of the direction of any competently written story because the writer will never betray their themes. Deltarune is unfinished, so its messages aren't made apparent quite yet, so that is what I would like to speculate on and provide a backbone to any theory that wishes to incorporate them. Without further ado, let's examine the themes of Deltarune chapters 1 and 2. First is the topic that actually does get some attention within the community, and that is the subject of agency. When you first start up the game, you are given various options to customize your character, which all get thrown out with a message that you cannot choose who you are in this world, and you have the character of Chris foisted into your control. It's important to note that Chris and the player are regarded as different entities by the game. The name attached to your save file is actually your own name, not the one you were trying to give your creation, and it actually overwrites Chris's name upon your first save. The heart-shaped soul seems to represent the player, as it's also what Chris removes from their body to regain control at several moments within the story. It also represents not only Chris, but the whole party. It can take damage for any of your party members, and even represents Susie when we play as her in our fight against Lancer. Now that that's established, let's examine the more ambiguous or implied instances that make sense when this is applied. As many have pointed out, Ralsei seems to be attempting to lure the player away to speak to Chris alone at one point in Chapter 2. We can actually confirm that the player is indeed with Susie and not Chris, as we can attempt to select dialogue options with... Yep, that's the heart. Dialogue choices in Deltarune are the will of the player, represented by the heart as the cursor. So far, we have been able to give orders to two and only two characters, Chris and Susie. Chris seems to be more or less entirely susceptible to our commands. However, there are some particular instances where Chris seems to be attempting to communicate past the player's choices. Take this one instance for example, where after witnessing the death of Spamton Neo, Chris is asked by Susie if they're alright. You are given the options yes and no. If you choose yes, it comes out hoarse, and if you choose no, Chris shouts the response. Interestingly, there is nothing like this in the Snowgrave route of Deltarune in Chapter 2, where Chris coldly says proceed over and over. Could this be their true nature, or does the player have even more control in this route? Susie, on the other hand, outright ignores the player every time. Seriously, she will always say the same thing in every instance regardless of the player's choices. This makes sense as she seems to embody that rebel archetype, but what are its implications? And where will this take us later in the story? If the player is the true villain of Deltarune, will she become the hero? The Steam page of Deltarune has an interesting nugget here. It says there will be only one ending, but there's a question mark there. Guys, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Whenever there's an ambiguous dichotomy in a work of fiction or a binary question is raised like this, the answer usually is both yes and no. So what does this mean for Deltarune? Well, we see in the Snowgrave route, while having the same basic ending, has drastically different implications in terms of its outcomes. I want to remind you all that this was essentially how the neutral route of Undertale goes. You can make choices that affect the playthrough in various ways, but the climax of the story and the final boss will always be the same, with only a little phone call at the end acknowledging the specifics of your journey. Could Snowgrave be setting the expectation here, and we'll get a similarly fashioned conclusion? Well, that's one possibility. Maybe a cataclysmic event renders the player's actions entirely pointless. Wouldn't matter in the end if everyone dies, for example. Those are the face value interpretations. It could also happen in a more metaphorical sense. I couldn't give you an exact theory of how this could pan out because we are so far from the ending, but maybe something like there are multiple interpretations, that certain routes lean more into one or the other, or maybe Chris is in the same condition in any ending. I'm just spitballing here. My main point is to give you ammunition for your own theories. The last thing I want to touch on is escapism. It's embedded into the plot of Deltarune as the characters quote-unquote escape into the dark realm to live in fantasy. They are ducking out of their real-world responsibilities such as homework and into another potentially imaginary one. It's any kid's dream. Anyone who has played Deltarune understands that there is a connection between the Light World's rooms and objects and the Dark World and its inhabitants. But what I want to look at in particular is the final scene in the main route, before Chris and Susie confront the second main fountain. Our protagonists reflect on their adventure and comment about how cool it was. Susie comes to the conclusion that the Dark World is simply better than the one she comes from. Noelle admits that while she wouldn't want a world ruled by Queen, she didn't take an issue with her plans to expand the Dark World. Burley takes note of his friend's musings and declares he will do so by his own blade. It is here that Ralsei interrupts him to deliver exposition on why it had to be stopped. Much needed exposition, mind you. This fantasy lore stuff is the least interesting aspect of Deltarune to me, but it does have a bearing on the story and its messages, so it cannot be ignored. I won't bore you by reciting all the details you already know and can currently see on screen, but the takeaway from all of this is that there are negative consequences to the fun escapism our heroes indulge in, potentially world-ending in scope. They aren't actively worsening anything though, in fact they are shutting these fountains down, so what's the harm? Our heroes still don't understand what they're dealing with. Even if they know it logically, that is at total odds with how they feel. None of them seem particularly shaken at these revelations past the moment they were told, and instead the object of their reflection is again how cool their adventures were. It hits Susie that she played a part in protecting the world from ruin, but it only feeds her wanderlust. This culminates in the final scene of the chapter where we see Chris carve out a new fountain with their own hands. Whether this implies they are the knight or simply figured out how to do it after being told by Queen is up to speculation and frankly anybody's guess. But regardless of what you believe, Chris's actions remain the same. Despite having been just warned, they are opening another fountain. With all of this in mind, what kind of conclusions can be drawn? Well, it's up to the individual to decide how they want to include the thematic elements into their theories, but I'll summarize some of the vague guesses of my own. Since it hasn't by this point, when it should be readily apparent to Chris and Susie, I believe the ambiguity of the Dark World's connection to the Light World will never be spelled out. That isn't to say that aspects of that ambiguity won't be explored, in fact they probably will, but I think there won't be a perfect direct answer, leading the story to have multiple interpretations. I also doubt there will ever be a direct confrontation between the characters in the game to the player, though I do think it will be made more apparent and obvious to casual players as the story progresses, like how Toby's previous work directly implicates gameplay elements to tell its story. As many others suspect, I could see it being ultimately tied to Gaster, with him or some version of his will being the true enemy, with some aspects of the player represented through him and his experiments. The power fantasy of the Dark Worlds will slowly deteriorate in the minds of the characters as more serious events take place and more get involved. In fact, we could start seeing this as soon as Chapter 3 with the inclusion of Toriel and potentially Undyne, who are adults and won't see things the same way as the children do. Toriel in particular is known to be overly protective and may be against participation in these dangerous adventures. An ultimatum will be reached when the story has to tackle the question of whether escapism is good or acceptable, and of course I think the answer is yes. Video games themselves are a form of escapism I'm sure Toby favors, and the series seems to be a love letter to that. But there will also have to be an illustration of how this can go wrong being shown in the narrative, because it's just too early for statements like these to be made by the characters and not have them be subverted later. I hope I got your mind racing with new directions in where to take your theorizing and overall consideration of the series in this short time. And with that, I go by Tasty Nachos, and you go by.